welcome back everybody. I hope you had a chance to enjoy our exhibition upstairs over morning tea. To introduce our next panel, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Noreen Chowdhury. Noreen is the Director of Communications and Engagement in the Legislative Council, who oversees communications for the department, including social media, and has led the promotion of the very extensive program of Bicentenary events and activities we have enjoyed this year, including this conference. Prior to joining the Council, Noreen worked across both the private and public sector, here in Australia and over several years in the UK. Please join me in welcoming Noreen to the stage.
Thank you, Janelle. Our next panel features two leading voices on parliamentary democracy in the Asia-Pacific region. Relations between the Parliament of New South Wales and the Asia-Pacific are of great importance. A key initiative is the Parliamentary Twinning Program. The Parliament of New South Wales is twinned with the National Parliament of the Solomon Islands and the Bougainville House of Representatives. This program allows the parliaments involved to strengthen their relations and also to learn from each other. The panel will look into the evolving political landscape more broadly in the Asia-Pacific region. I have the pleasure to introduce Mihai Sora, Director of the Pacific Islands Program at the Lowy Institute, and Lord Fakafanua, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Tonga. Mihai Sora is Director of the Pacific Islands Program at the Lowy Institute, a program that has a political research focus on contemporary challenges facing the Pacific Islands region. These challenges include geostrategic competition, sustainable economic development, governance, and leadership. Mihai's research focus is on regional dynamics and the roles of the United States, China, and Australia in the Pacific. His analysis has appeared in publications such as the Australian Financial Review, The Australian, The Guardian, and The Interpreter, as well as several major international outlets. Before joining the Lowy Institute, Mihai was an Australian diplomat with postings to Solomon Islands and Indonesia, as well as short-term deployments throughout the Pacific. Fatafehi Fakafanua is a Tongan politician, Lord of the Realm, and the Speaker of the Tongan Legislative Assembly. He is the 8th Lord Fakafanua. At age 24, he became one of the youngest members of Parliament in Tongan history, and at age 27, Lord Fakafanua assumed the role of Speaker of the Parliament as the youngest ever elected by the Parliament to that office in Tonga, and at the time, the youngest speaker in the world. Over the course of his political career, Lord Fakafanua has been engaged with monumental changes in the Tongan Parliament, including presiding over major political reform and passionately advocating for greater representation of women and youth in Parliament. In 2014, Lord Fakafanua took a break from politics to pursue further studies. But since then, he has resumed his role as the incumbent Speaker of the Parliament after being re-elected in 2017 and subsequently in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Mihai Sora and Lord Fakafanua.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mihai, and I'm from the Lowy Institute here in Sydney. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here and online today, as we explore the themes of democracy, self-determination, and political representation in our near region. The Lowy Institute is an independent international relations think tank. We're just down the road. Our aim is to understand developments in our region and also the global forces shaping international politics. And there's a lot going on even for December, especially for December, I should say. But let me start by thanking you for this opportunity to reflect on the future of democracy in the Pacific. And I look forward to your questions after both our speakers present their remarks. Now, if we take this moment today as a snapshot and look across the Pacific, we can see a very dynamic and diverse democratic system and systems across the various countries. In Tonga, yesterday, the Prime Minister resigned ahead of a motion of no confidence, and my esteemed co-panelist may wish to reflect on this in his remarks later. In Solomon Islands, the opposition lodged a motion of no confidence in incumbent Prime Minister Jeremiah Maneli some 8 months into his term, which may be debated this week. In Vanuatu, the parliament was dissolved earlier last month, and we may see an election in January, although the dissolution itself has been challenged in the courts. New Caledonia, a French territory, is still in the throes of managing its journey of self-determination amid conflicting political forces and will be impacted by the French Prime Minister resigning after a motion of no confidence against him in Paris. In Papua New Guinea, the autonomous government of Bougainville continues its agenda to achieve political independence through a process agreed at the signing of the Bougainville Peace Agreement in 2001. Aside from this, there are ongoing discussions of political reform in Papua New Guinea, seeking to balance political stability with executive accountability and political freedoms. In the past 12 months, we've seen elections across the Pacific, including in Palau, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Solomon Islands. Now, as we consider the pressures shaping governance in the region, it's clear that Pacific democracies stand at a crossroads. This is not a story of struggle, but a story of resilience, a story of how Pacific nations navigate challenges that are deeply global, but also distinctly local. And today I want to explore the complex web of forces influencing the region's democracies and offer some thoughts on what these trends might mean for the future of democracy in the Pacific. So let's take a look at the pressures facing Pacific democracies. Geopolitical pressures. The Pacific is at the heart of intensifying great power competition. It's something that I write and speak about quite often, so very happy to go into that in the Q&A. Now, this dynamic is profoundly affecting how governance is evolving in the region. Countries like China, the United States, and traditional partners like Australia and New Zealand are vying for influence, often through aid, infrastructure projects, military agreements, support to local media, even sports agreements. Now, while these relationships bring economic opportunities, they also raise questions about sovereignty and the long-term implications of foreign dependence. Pacific nations face difficult choices about how to balance competing interests while preserving their autonomy in a context of great developmental and economic need. Two very recent examples: a treaty that Australia signed with the tiny nation of Nauru earlier this week. In essence, this is a deal that establishes a form of shared sovereignty over some aspects of Nauru's foreign and defense policy in exchange for support for Nauru's economic viability. The Whalepili Union that Australia signed with Tuvalu is a deal where sovereignty is shared in exchange for Tuvalu's existential viability due to the impacts of climate change. These are small Pacific countries, but the political and legal consequences of these deals are quite significant. This geopolitical environment risks fragmenting regional solidarity. Pacific nations find themselves pulled between pro-Western and pro-China political forces. And this complicates their efforts to address shared regional challenges like climate change and economic recovery. On economic pressures, democracy thrives when economic systems provide stability and opportunity, but many Pacific economies remain vulnerable. Reliance on sectors such as tourism, fisheries, and remittances from overseas labor, leaves Pacific nations exposed to external shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how quickly economic disruptions can strain public services and erode trust in governments. Debt dependency. Some Pacific nations are heavily indebted to China, but also more recently to Australia and to multilateral development banks through infrastructure loans, raising concerns about fiscal sustainability and sovereignty. Debt distress can undermine government credibility and limit policy options for addressing pressing social and environmental needs. Climate change, it's not just an environmental issue, it is fundamentally reshaping governance across the Pacific. Rising sea levels and extreme weather events are already displacing communities, creating governance challenges around land tenure, resource allocation, and migration. These disruptions will test the capacity of governments to respond equitably and sustainably. As arable land and freshwater sources become scarcer, internal conflicts over resource distribution will intensify, challenging democratic processes and social cohesion. Societal and technological shifts. Pacific societies are experiencing rapid change, bringing both opportunities and risks for democracy. The migration of people from rural to urban areas, a dynamic that's been going on for a few decades but accelerating, is changing the social fabric of Pacific nations. Urbanization brings rising inequality, with urban elites wielding disproportionate political and economic power, while rural communities risk marginalization. This creates tensions within communities and also strains traditional and cultural norms. Digital connectivity. With increased internet access rolling out across the Pacific through subsea cables, low Earth orbit satellites, and greater internal access to digital services, there have been increased opportunities for civic engagement. But Pacific communities are now more exposed than ever to threats from cyber criminals and foreign governments engaging in misinformation, online scams, and manipulation. So challenges from cyber risks and threats to online safety. These trends can exacerbate community polarization, an issue that is often debated with respect to domestic social cohesion here in Australia, and undermine trust in democratic institutions. Youthful populations. Many Pacific nations have rapidly growing youth populations, creating both a challenge and an opportunity. You might see a recurring theme here, which is everything is a double-edged sword or a two-sided issue. If governance systems fail to provide education, jobs, and political representation, youth frustration may lead to disengagement or unrest. Now, examples of this structural tension surfacing can be seen in the outbreaks of violence in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea's capital, in January this year, periodic unrest in Solomon Islands, and the civil strife in New Caledonia, although of course there are other political factors involved in each of those scenarios. In Micronesian states, populations are decreasing, creating a different set of pressures altogether. But the other side of that coin is that young people can be a driving force, both for democratic renewal and for economic innovation. An old tension, but one that's becoming increasingly prominent, traditional versus modern governance. Pacific governance systems often blend democratic institutions with traditional structures. Now, this hybrid approach has strengths, but it also creates friction. Customary leadership versus electoral accountability. Traditional leaders wield significant authority, sometimes clashing with elected officials. This is more so the case in rural areas rather than in urban centers. But this dual system can create confusion around accountability and again, weaken public trust in formal democratic institutions. The role of faith and civil society. Religious organizations play a hugely significant role in Pacific societies, often acting as moral arbiters and service providers, particularly health and education. While this is generally positive, it also means that democratically elected government officials, government representatives, sometimes struggle to assert their authority in key policy areas. Again, health and education. Women in politics. Women's political representation in Pacific Island parliamentary systems remains significantly below global averages at around 8% of parliamentary seats, compared to an average of 26% globally, reflecting ongoing challenges in achieving gender parity in political leadership. The underrepresentation of women in Pacific Island parliaments is influenced by factors such as traditional social norms, limited access to political networks, and systemic barriers within political institutions themselves. And something that I touched on at the beginning of my remarks, frequent motions of no confidence. Motions of no confidence are common in Pacific Island countries due to a combination of structural, cultural, and contextual factors that shape the political systems. So these motions are generally destabilizing, but are also a reflection of the dynamic and fluid nature of Pacific politics. At its core, the tactic is a reflection of the focus on individual personalized leadership over systems and institutions. This is a transplant from traditional chiefly governance structures and reflects a community expectation and therefore a priority for individual MPs on personal management of service delivery in their respective constituencies. So parliamentarians are deliverers of services as well as legislators, two quite separate roles, but two that they have to carry simultaneously. Beyond this, regional and clan-based loyalties rather than ideological or national political identities greatly affect voter behavior and community expectations. So what does the future hold for Pacific democracies? Well, we'll see a continued blending of traditional and modern systems. However, maintaining balance will be increasingly challenging as external pressures grow. Geopolitics will continue to place pressure on Pacific countries. Climate change pressures will continue to increase, demographic and economic pressures, and so on. So the trend is increasing pressure, increasing strain on existing systems. Nations may need to redefine the roles of customary leaders and elected officials to achieve clarity and cohesion in governance. Regional cooperation, as seen through the Pacific Islands Forum, that's the region's peak political and economic and cultural body, will face tests of unity. We see this time and again as geopolitical and economic divides within Pacific blocs and between individual Pacific countries widen. Smaller nations may increasingly rely on special relationships with larger countries, for example, the Nauru and Tuvalu deals, and others like them in the North Pacific or in Polynesia. Or they may turn to more organic coalitions like the Polynesian Leaders Group or the Melanesian Spearhead Group or the Micronesian Bloc, broadly reflecting geographic and ethnic commonalities among Pacific countries, to amplify their voices. This will compete with whole-of-region approaches. As climate impacts worsen, Pacific democracies may pivot towards governance models focused on survival and adaptation, shifting priorities away from long-term institution building to crisis management. But this pressure may also spur innovation, such as the development of regional mechanisms to address displacement, shared resource management, shared sovereignty arrangements, and climate finance. We've seen evidence on the climate finance front in the form of the recently established Pacific Resilience Facility, a Pacific-owned and Pacific-managed climate fund. Digital democracy. So the Pacific's growing digital landscape will redefine how democracy operates. Online platforms offer opportunities for civic engagement, particularly for youth and diaspora communities. But governments will need to combat the risks of misinformation and ensure equitable access and digital literacy to safeguard democratic processes. And youth. Pacific youth are likely to play an increasingly prominent role in shaping democracy. Their own cultural norms are different from the generations that precede them. Their access to international narratives, their sense of individual identity spans beyond their traditional communities. This will shape their expectations for their political leaders and for themselves in the role that they play in their communities. We're likely to see increased grassroots activism, digital campaigns, and demands for representation, even in traditional governance systems. Youth leadership can drive reforms in areas like gender equality, climate action, and economic opportunity. And the ever-present external actor. The influence of external actors will continue to shape the trajectory of Pacific democracies. While engagement can provide resources and capacity building, the challenge will be ensuring that partnerships respect local agency and prioritize long-term governance strengthening over short-term strategic interests. Easier said than done. Overall, we're faced with a region that is navigating the complex tensions between global and local forces. The pressures are immense: geopolitical competition, climate change, economic vulnerability, social transformation. But the resilience of Pacific communities offers hope. Pacific democracies have shown remarkable adaptability in the past, drawing on cultural strengths, collective action. Pacific countries are asserting their agency more frequently and in louder and stronger terms in regional, global, and in bilateral forums. As the region moves forward, the key will be finding ways to empower citizens, strengthen democratic institutions, parliament-to-parliament links, for example, preserve sovereignty, and embrace innovative approaches to governance. I wish to conclude by reflecting that the Pacific as a region, diverse as it is not a passive recipient of these global trends. Pacific countries are making strategic decisions on a daily basis. Pacific leaders are making decisions that shape the future of their country on a daily basis. So think of the Pacific region as actively shaping its democratic future in the face of overwhelming international forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mihai. We'll be joined by Lord Fakafanua live from Tonga, so just give us one moment and we'll have him up on the screen. Thank you. Over to you.
Can you all hear me? Yes. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow panelist, Mihai Sora, and observe all protocol. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to speak to such a distinguished group this morning from Tonga. I was supposed to join you in person, but unfortunately, we had some recent political developments. As Mihai alluded to, we had a vote of no confidence in Parliament yesterday, which I had to preside over, and unexpectedly, the Prime Minister Sovaleni Hokovmeliku resigned, which has caused a bit of a shake-up in our political system here in Tonga. But I'm very happy to have been invited by David to speak to you this morning about developments in Pacific regarding the future of democracy. And I'm pleased to hear Mihai Sora give a great snapshot of the challenges due to the geopolitical tensions in the region, climate change, and the economic struggles that small island developing states have, which is a future of the small islands being having narrow economic bases, and now with more intense and more fierce external shocks such as tropical cyclones, we're seeing a greater impact on the islands, and in particularly for Tonga, in 2018, we saw our parliament be destroyed by a tropical cyclone. And so talking about the future development of democracy in the islands, I think it's important to frame it around the developmental needs of what are essentially nascent democracies. In 2010, we had democratic reform, which saw a lot of the executive power that was with His Majesty the King granted to the people in Parliament. And the People's Representative seats was expanded from 9 members to 17, so that they hold the majority of seats in the House, and the Lords retained the status quo of 9 seats. So altogether in our Parliament, we have 26 members. And since the 2010 democratic reforms, we've been refining our democracy, and I would have to say 14 years later, we're still going through teething issues. In the previous governments up until today, not a single government hasn't seen vote of no confidence. The vote of no confidence was a new feature introduced after the reforms of 2010. And like many other of our neighboring nations, we're experiencing votes of no confidence every parliamentary term. And given that our history of tribalism, I think that Mihai rightly put it, it is a feature of our resilience, and one that I explained to the House yesterday, that votes of no confidence are designed to ensure that our government, the executive power, retains the majority support of the Parliament upon which it comes from, its democratic mandate. And I, in my experience, the only reason why we fall into this trap of votes of no confidence is because of personality-led politics. And this has seen us detract from what we should really be moving towards, and that is, in my belief, national policies rather than personally led agendas. And I think over time, with the maturing of our democracies, we'll overcome that, and it only comes with time. I mean, the United Kingdom had 900 years to evolve the democracy, and we've only had 14 years. So I think we're doing so far very well, considering that Tonga is a peaceful country and we're still abiding very closely to our constitution, despite the use of these mechanisms more often than we would like. So in terms of like the regional outlook, Tonga is a member of the Commonwealth, and as such, we participate in the CPA, which is a global grouping of ex-British Empire countries. Now we are the Commonwealth. And even though Tonga has retained its sovereignty and we have our own king, we are a member of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, which His Majesty the King, King Charles, is the royal patron of. So through the CPA, we have very close affiliations with other Commonwealth parliaments, such as Australia and New Zealand in our regional neighbourhood. In particularly with Australia, we have the twinning parliament arrangement, and Tongan Parliament twins with South Australia. We have a very close relationship with the South Australian Parliament. In fact, we're having bilateral exchanges, sharing of knowledge and resources. In fact, after the vote no conference yesterday, my counterpart, the Speaker, Leon Bignell from South Australia, sent me his regards and their support. So in terms of the level of engagement that we have between these twinning arrangements, it differs from parliament to from state to state and parliament to parliament. So New South Wales, for instance, has a very good relationship with their twin Solomon Islands. So apart from the CPA in the Southeast Asia grouping, the Indonesian government, through the Indonesia Pacific Parliamentary Partnership, has been engaging with the Pacific parliaments for some time now, for the past 4 to 5 years. And this engagement is around Indonesia's aspiration to be the gateway for the Pacific into ASEAN. And they've held very high level conferences between their speaker and their counterparts in the Pacific in that regional engagement, which is very interesting because ASEAN could serve as a growth market for a lot of these Pacific Island countries. And as a non-traditional partner, this opens up more opportunities given the regional global play that is happening between the East and the West of the Pacific. I think one of the most important developments right now on the back of the success of the Pacific Island Forum, which is an executive body, is the development of the Pacific Island Parliamentary Group, dubbed by Senator or President Sue Lines PIPG. PIPG is a pan-Pacific parliamentary group, and it is unlike the Pan-Africa groups and the European groups and South American groups. No such group exists in the Pacific. There is no Pan-Pacific democratic group in the Pacific. And so the inception of PIPG is something that is new. It came out of meetings in Papeete and Tahiti. In fact, I'm currently on a working group that is exploring the modalities and future formation for the formalization of PIPG as a proper international organization. PIPG has memberships from across the Pacific, from Micronesia to Melanesia to Polynesia, from Australia to non-sovereign countries such as Rapa Nui, to state legislatures such as the Hawaii legislature, to other sovereign countries in the North Pacific such as Palau. And this is probably the most exciting development in democracy across the Pacific. We do not we do not exclude non-independent legislatures. So we acknowledge traditional groups such as the Rapa Nui Assembly, from FSM to sovereign countries such as Fiji and Tonga. This is probably the most exciting development in the Pacific that I'm quite passionate about. So from there, we have development and regional cooperations assisted by the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, which is an implementation program, is specifically talking about what we call PPEI, Pacific Parliament Effectiveness Initiative. And this is a program that the UNDP is delivering, funded by the Australian government, the New Zealand government, Japan, depends on the program. But some of the programs under PPEI that are very successful is the floating budget office, for instance. During the budget cycles of the different parliaments, we would have officers from Fiji station themselves in Tonga in the preparation of our budget. And when Fiji's budget sessions are about to come into play, then Tongan or Solomon Island officers would go to Fiji and assist them in the formation of their budget as well. And the floating budget office is designed to create concise documents that synthesize government budgets and into graphs and easy to read formats for members of parliament to be able to scrutinize the executive budget more effectively. And it's been very popular and quite effective across the Pacific. So that's one of the programs that have come out of PPEI that is funded by New Zealand right now in partnership with UNDP. Speaking about the future of democracy, we're looking at trying to minimize disruptions caused by democratic mechanisms like the vote of no confidence. And by shortening timelines, we can ensure that, for example, if a government loses confidence in the House, we can replace that government within 48 hours so that there's minimum disruption to the country, and for the government, there is continuity. And so a lot of that reform we can only refine with experience. And so after the Prime Minister resigned yesterday prior to the vote of no confidence, we've definitely highlighted some features of our constitution that need to be amended in the future to ensure that we have much more smoother vote of no confidence the next time we encounter some of this. But because of the unprecedented time, we can only know with experience. One key feature that was introduced in Tonga's democracy after reform in 2010 is the introduction of constituency development funds. Mihai Sora explained that the function and role of our members of parliament are somewhat multiple, given that they are both legislators and service providers. Somewhat perhaps controversially, the Constituency Development Fund, which is some see as a campaign fund or a slush fund, that is given to members of parliament, that's designed to address gaps of service that are provided from the executive government. Because the parliament member is closer to his constituency, he can address some of those shortfalls using the CDF or Constituency Development Fund. It can arguably be a point of temptation for members of parliament, and in some constituencies it is perceived to be used as more of a campaign mechanism rather than a service delivery tunnel for the constituencies. And so in trying to address some of these perceived issues, we are looking at internet connectivity and technology to ensure greater transparency on these funds and better accountability. So practical things like setting up websites and social media accounts where you have a running tally and a score of where the constituency development funds are being allocated in each constituency, and the constituents are aware of where their member of parliament are allocating their these scarce resources. So when I think about democracy and the evolution of the Pacific region from a global perspective, Tonga is also a member of the Interparliamentary Union, the IPU, which mirrors the work that the CPA does. But the Interparliamentary Union is probably one of the oldest intergovernmental organizations in the world, based in Geneva. It predates the League of Nations and the United Nations. It is very old and is a grouping of parliaments from all around the world. The United States is one of the founding members, but is not actually a current participating member of the IPU, but we can meet and have bilaterals in the IPU with counterparts from China to France to the Speaker of Ukraine to delegations from Russia. It is very important for us to be able to participate on these global forums, given that there is a wealth of experience and knowledge and exchange that happens at the IPU conferences that happen twice a year. Unfortunately, the membership of Pacific parliaments in the IPU are one of the lowest in all the regions. And this is due to a lack of resource and an inability of most of the parliaments in the Pacific to, one, pay the dues, the annual subscriptions to be a member of the IPU, but also to send effective delegations to these meetings, which happen once in Geneva every year, and then rotate on the memberships every other meeting. And this has given our budget in Parliament a considerable strain, especially in the last 2 years since I was elected as a Asia Pacific member of and representative of the Youth Forum of the IPU. And my term ends in March next year, just as I turn 40. And one of the reforms that our board has implemented is the reduction of young parliamentarians from the age of 45 down to 40. And it's a bit crazy to think that in the political realm, 45 is still considered young. That's because the mean age of a parliamentarian is still very old. And so in line with the work that we do at the Interparliamentary Union, we also advocate for greater transparency, anti-corruption, democratic rights, youth engagement and participation, women participation in politics, and most particularly relevant to the Pacific nations, because we see this as a security issue, is the problem of climate change and the lack of response from the global north to the changing times in terms of ensuring they have NCDs or national determined contributions that match the ambition required for us to keep our temperature rise below 1.5 according to the Paris Agreement. And so in our parliament, we are looking forward to the trilateral project between Tonga, Australia, and New Zealand in the reconstruction of our parliament building. We see this as an important partnership between three democracies in the Pacific and empowering our people and our democracy. And it's very fitting that the people of Australia and New Zealand are assisting Tonga in rebuilding our parliament. And because of the climate change and rising sea level, we've had to move our parliament from its site where it resided for over 100 years to a new location that is higher and more resilient for climate change in the future. So in summary, I'd just like to say that there are many challenges that we are facing in our parliament in Tonga. Our processes are still very nascent. Our members are still discovering their role. The members of parliament are still finding their feet in terms of the balance between being a legislator and a point of service provider for their constituents. We are still exploring this, and we're still refining our democracy through our legislative processes. Our standing orders are currently being scrutinized, given that we have just undertaken with the CPA a benchmark study, which has resulted in about 19 recommendations. And the score from our benchmark has given us a resounding pass in terms of our democratic rights and processes. So I'm very happy with that, but the work hasn't stopped. We're just beginning to explore ways of ensuring we have a more effective democracy that reaches our population and encourages more civic participation. And hopefully I'll be around for a few more years to ensure that what we hand over to the next generation is something that we can all be proud of in terms of Tonga's democracy and our burgeoning middle class, and the pool of politicians is growing and not diminishing, and that trust in democratic system hasn't eroded to a point where fake news or popularism takes over. So those are just some of my thoughts, but I think maybe be more appropriate if you have any more questions I can help you with. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you, David, for inviting me to participate in this program. Malo Abito.
Thank you to both of you for sharing your insights with us. So we'll now be taking some questions from the audience, including those who are with us online. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll direct one of the microphones to you. So right there, thank you.
Thank you very much for those two fascinating speeches. From the Tonga perspective, I was very pleased to learn about the new or relatively new Indonesia partnerships with Pacific parliaments, and also the PIPG initiative, which seems a very logical step. My question is about, you referred to in the International Parliamentary Union the usefulness of dealing with learning or sharing experiences with a wide range of parliaments, including China. Obviously, China is a very important trading partner, but I'm wondering, in the context of parliamentary exchanges, how useful that is, given the nature of all powers with the Communist Party in China and not with the National People's Congress. Thank you.
Just to give you an idea of some of the outtakes and the potential points of engagement with China. When there was the development target in the United Nations called the Millennium Development Goals, which has now been superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals was poverty alleviation. And the global target for poverty alleviation was only achieved in the Millennium Development Goals because of what China claims to have achieved in terms of their poverty alleviation. The sheer number of people that they took out of poverty, which is sometimes determined by $1 a day, and in some jurisdictions, like in India, it's based on a calorie intake. The programs in our exchanges were very useful for us when we would visit China, and they would take us on tours of how they implement their poverty alleviation programs. Now, a lot of the approaches that we see, particularly from the West, cannot be implemented immediately somewhere that is still developing in the islands. And on that point, I see a lot of merit in South-to-South cooperation, because the level of development and the contexts are very similar. And so the obstacle to implementation of some of these programs are very low-hanging fruit for some of our legislators. So that's just one of the key takeaways from an exchange with somewhere like China. So you have to look beyond the obvious, and it's a bit like a buffet. You take what you like and you leave what you don't.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We have a question right there. Thank you.
My question will be on New Caledonia. During the protests, we saw a new regional player, Azerbaijan, which is an oil-rich dictatorial regime, and also it's trying to change the political system in New Caledonia. Does the Azerbaijan as a new player pose a real threat to democracy in Asia Pacific?
I think it's important not to overstate the impact of that campaign. It contributed to the disruption. It contributed to misinformation, but it's important not to take away from the genuinely felt political grievances within New Caledonia, their journey of self-determination and the tensions there between the official position of the metropolitan power in France and political stakeholders in New Caledonia. So, we live in a world where there'll always be insincere or non-genuine inputs into all discourses, but that's not to detract from the real conversation, which is the question of New Caledonian self-determination.
Right there, just 2 rows in front as well, please. Thank you.
So I just wanted to get your opinions on the age-old question of state sovereignty versus complex interdependence. So for nations like islands in the Asia-Pacific region, you're tackling transnational issues like climate change, and you're working with IGOs like ASEAN and global governance institutions like the UN and the UNDP. For the future, do you predict that there might be some financial debt or some type of dependency caused because of that will then hinder further development of democratic institutions down the line?
Do you want to respond first to that one? No?
Is that to me or?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes, to you.
Oh, right. Yes. Well, every year we have a donor meeting where multilaterals and bilateral partners attend, and we look at what we call the NIP, which is the National Infrastructure Program, and it's basically the country's wish list. And it could span from a high school to a bridge to a new power station. And they sort of negotiate. But the last meeting with donors that I went to, I was quite critical of the whole system, because as a Tongan and a proud Tongan that is, I am wary of donor dependency. And so the desired outcome of ODA, official donor assistance, should be for sovereignty and independence, financial independence. And so it's very, very important that we're not just ticking boxes when we talk with our bilateral and multilateral partners. It needs to be towards that outcome. So we have to set up our infrastructure so that we can become more independent, so we can ensure that we're widening that economic base. And so to the question that was posed from the front, yes, we are quite concerned, and we don't want our debt levels to be at a point where our democracies and our independence of choice is compromised. That is something that we're very cognizant of, but one that we have little control over. And so, as a small player that has minimal impact on what happens around the world, all we can do is accept what we get from everyone and have little choice on who we can deny access to in our nations. And apart from that, ideologically, we have a foreign policy of enemy to no one and friend to everyone. And so we have to ensure that we become more resilient to insulate ourselves from external shocks, and not just economic shocks, but also geopolitical shocks. And the smart play there in terms of real life example, when the war in Ukraine started and OPEC restrictions happened, oil prices saw inflation in Tonga in the double digits. Now, for us, even though we are espousing climate change action, decarbonizing our economy is actually insulating ourselves from those external shocks. It's not just good for the environment, but because Pacific Islands contribute 0.02% of carbon emissions, it doesn't matter if we decarbonize. What matters is when we decarbonize, we unplug ourselves from those external shocks, we insulate ourselves from those problems.
Amazing.
I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Mihai, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think that's a terrific question. And in the broadest sense, that is an issue that is constantly debated within the Pacific. And it's a question that a donor country like Australia thinks about all the time in its engagement with the region and with individual countries. The answer is different for every Pacific country. Particularly for a country like Nauru or Tuvalu right now, it's a very pointed question and a very pointed answer, and it speaks to the reality that for some Pacific nations, for some of the micro-states, they are not economically viable without a permanent relationship with some sort of larger partner. Another way to look at it is that for the challenges facing the region, climate change, transnational crime, the tensions within democratic institutions, Pacific countries do depend on each other and on international partners. So, there's a sort of, in the natural sense of the word dependency, I think globally right now we're facing a reality where we all depend on each other to some degree or another. The ultimate goal for all donor countries should be to achieve economic independence in their recipient countries. And I think that would be a headline priority for all Pacific Island countries. That's certainly what the leaders are frequently trying to tell us. And there's an opportunity there for Pacific countries to interrogate and rearrange the sorts of development programs that are presented to them. I think what geopolitics has done for the region is given Pacific countries more leverage to improve the balance in those relations. So typically, development programs have been mostly a function of supply rather than demand. And I think with, if you have multiple offers from multiple partners, you now have a bit more agency to say, well, thanks for all of these kinds of programs that you give to us because it reflects the skill set that you have or the resources that you have, but we don't want these, we want these things. So you're seeing a rearrangement in some aspects of the development relationships. So a lot of that is about addressing this issue of long-term dependency.
We have a question right here with David.
Thank you both so much for those great presentations. Lord Speaker, particularly thank you for joining us today. You give us all a great sense of confidence that the future of parliamentary democracy in the Pacific is in really good hands. I have two questions, and they both relate to things that I've heard you speak about at the Presiding Officers and Clerks Conference over the last 2 years, but I also wonder whether Mihai might want to comment on them as well. The first one, we had a presentation this morning about AI and its potential role in relation to parliamentary democracy. In 2023, I think you freaked us all out with a presentation about an experience with a deep fake in the Tongan Parliament. I wonder if you might share that story with the audience this morning. Secondly, the second question relates to the frequency of not only no confidence motions in Pacific jurisdictions, but also the frequency of recourse to the courts for the resolution of fundamentally political issues. This year you talked about a couple of really important court cases in Tonga that had the potential perhaps to be an antidote to that frequent recourse to the courts. I wonder if you could say something about that as well.
Thank you, David. I almost forgot about all those experiences. In one of our sessions, we had one of our members speak as he ordinarily does, and within 30 minutes, there was audio of him circulating on social media and actually picked up by mainstream media in Tonga of him swearing in the House. And it was so seamless. If you didn't hear the live transmission of the House, you would believe that he did swear in the House. And it got to the point where we had to revisit Hansard and replay the real audio within the House so that the members themselves can be assured that it never happened, even though it didn't happen. And obviously there was some AI technology used to augment his speech and insert things that he didn't say. But what shocked us was how quickly it happened. This happened within the same day, within hours of it occurring, and it had to be rectified. And so I had to play the live audio from our records within the House, just so that the member can be at ease, because he was being attacked from all angles for abusing his position and swearing in the House. So that brought us to the current century. We thought that Tonga was the last place where we would experience AI and deepfakes, but there, beyond behold, we saw it in our democracy, in our parliament. The frequency of votes of no confidence, to me, it's still going to be a feature, and until we can move politics from personality led to national mandates, and I think because we don't have official parties in Tonga, it's still going to be the case moving forward. So all we can do is minimize the harm caused by votes of no confidence, and that's what we're doing by refining the relevant clauses in our constitution and also our standing orders to ensure that votes of no confidence are dealt with swiftly and resolved efficiently. The judicial reviews that you mentioned, they were a shock to the system, because I found myself personally attacked. Members of the House did not accept a resolution that was passed by a majority of the House, and so they decided to challenge the resolution by taking Parliament to court. And as leader of Parliament, I was named as a speaker in this judicial action. To be honest, when they took the action to the courts, we assumed that the courts would not touch a case that is within the ambit of the legislature. We assumed that the respective the Latimer House principles would be enough defense for us, but our courts decided to hear the case. And so we were sort of forced into a corner where our defense was we do not accept the court's jurisdiction in legislative matters due to the principle of separation of powers. And it got to the point where our case was heard by our highest court, which is the Court of Appeal. And the two judicial reviews reviewing decisions that I had made in the process of the House were heard by the Court of Appeal, and I won both cases of the judicial reviews. It went so far as to reinforce the authority of the Speaker as the final arbiter and interpreter of the rules and standing orders in the House in accordance with the Constitution. And so, full circle, the members who took me to court last year used the judicial review case and ruling to reaffirm my decision in the vote of no confidence yesterday, which is very ironic. The case that they lost, they used as an example to back their own arguments yesterday. So I was just laughing to myself and the clerk, thinking, there you go. Now they're going to use the case that they took me to court over for their own purposes. I mean, that politics is just really dirty, but that's the reality. And I'm just happy that because of the judicial review, the courts and the landmark precedent is in favor of the Speaker and Legislative Assembly's independence from the judiciary and the executive. It worked in our favor, even though we didn't ask for it, but it's reinforced our independence as a branch of the three branches.
Thank you. Were there any other questions? Yep, I think we have someone right there. Thank you.
So it's a question for both of you, and it's a question about women in parliaments in the Pacific, and which was mentioned earlier in one of the speeches. And I wonder, can you fill in a little bit more detail about what you see as measures or mechanisms that might improve the, what was it, 8% average, get that up higher, whether there are existing measures that work in some legislatures that could be adopted more broadly, or and so on. So thank you.
That's okay.
So we'll start with the amateur and then we'll turn to the professional. I don't think there is a single policy solution that can be applied even consistently within the same location. These are questions that are also a function of evolving cultural norms and also the political economy of individual systems. What is surprising is that it's not an uncontroversial objective even among female sectors of the population, among women, just to put it simply, as in you would naturally assume that the group you're seeking to, in your eyes, politically in power would go along with that. But it's contested in different ways there as well. So what that speaks to is just how complicated this notion of formal women's political representation is. And there are different possible solutions that are tried and tested in various contexts, to do with quotas within Parliament, quotas within parties, professional networking groups. Think of it like a talent pipeline for young athletes, those sorts of things, changing school curriculums, employing faith-based organizations to start to reshape expectations around gender norms with the assumption that it will then link in a positive way to actual increased political representation. There's questions there around redefining how we recognize political representation. So there's academic work saying, look, you're looking at seats in Parliament, but women's political representation happens in other ways also. And so we need to recognize that to fully quantify, if that's what we're seeking to do, the role that women play in their own politics. I think ultimately, solutions have to come from the individual political contexts themselves. I think as an external aid practitioner, you might have a toolkit of possible solutions, and then you need to co-design how they may be applied locally with where you're trying to get them to work. And I think you might be surprised with, what's accepted and what's rejected out of hand. This is just to say that it's not a straightforward metric that everyone is seeking to work towards.
I have to agree with everything Mihai has said. For the last decade, we've been struggling with this issue. And even today, we have one elected woman representation in our parliament and one appointed by the Prime Minister. So there are only two female members in our parliament. And it's something that I believe quite strongly about, because for 10 years now, we've been advocating for women representation. And I think when I synthesize the issue down, it comes down to a choice between the current system, where there is perceived to be no obstacle for women. They have the same opportunity to enter politics as men. And ensuring that we have a temporary special measure where we force women to be in parliament under a quota system. In my conversations with women, much of the obstacle is from within. In the last general election and all the elections that we've experienced, women, when faced between a choice of voting for one of their peers and a man, would rather choose a man than for a woman who's campaigning in their constituency. And the reasons are very complex. But I think until we can somehow consolidate that with the need to have more women in parliament, we won't see much change. And I have faith that the constant education and civic work that we're doing now will somehow bear fruit in a generation. And I think when you look at sustainable change and lasting change in our democracy and representation, it will have to be an intergenerational move to increase women representation. There is no clear-cut answer, because temporary special measures have been discussed and have been introduced in the past, but the biggest detractors from that are the women in our society. So unless there is change from within and on an individual level, I don't see much difference happening. And on that, I take solace in the fact that our civic education will probably bear fruit in the next generation.
Amazing, thank you so much. Did anyone else have a question? We might have time for one more. Just the lady there, thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question on, what do you think the importance of young people in the future? Because as we all know, young people are going to be running politics and political institution into the future. What do you think the importance of now for young people building those relationships, particularly between Australian parliaments and the various different institutions in Australia, and then those same institutions in the Pacific region? What do you think the importance of those ties at the moment between young people to build that mutual understanding, so that in 15, 20 years' time, those ties can be incredibly strong? And how do you think that can go about?
Lord Fakafanua, did you want to take that one?
Okay. Well, as a member of the Interparliamentary Union Youth Forum for Young Parliamentarians, we do a lot of work with young parliamentarians, and we understand that, especially in the global south, there is a very young demography, and in terms of Tonga specifically, over, I think it's 60% of our population is under the age of 40. Don't quote me on that, but we have a very young population, and our voting age is 21. However, in a move to capture the young and engage them early, I'm of the firm belief that we need to lower the voting age to something closer to 18. If you're old enough to go to war for the country or to drive and be responsible for passengers in your car, I think you are old enough to vote. And in Tonga, you can marry when you're 16 with your parents' permission, but you can't vote until you're 21. And I think that's absurd. And so yes, we both acknowledge the importance of youth engagement in the future of the country and our development, and we also acknowledge that not enough is being done. We understand that this day and age there is heavy competition for screen time, and the attention span is getting smaller and smaller. And so getting political concepts and democracy and parliament bills and legislation, a lot of these rules that govern everyone's day-to-day lives are often forsaken for the youth. And a lot of our youth are disenfranchised because they don't see themselves in political representation. They see Parliament as the domain of much older people, and so there is a lot of disinterest and disconnect. And part of the challenge that we have in building a modern democracy is trying to engage and reconnect with the youth population. And we're doing many things to do that. We're trying to be innovative in how we approach and capture the youth, from children's books about how democracy works, right through to youth parliaments that we host every year, to engaging them on their own playgrounds, on TikTok and Facebook and Twitter, engaging them. But it's a constantly moving target, one that hopefully will bear fruits in the future as our demography matures and our people become voting citizens. So yes, we are both concerned and engaged with the youth moving forward, and hopefully our new parliament will be reflective of that. We will have a new way of approaching the younger population. The new parliament will have space for civic education. There is a classroom. There is also a gallery for classes to come in and watch Parliament speak. So we're building the infrastructure towards more civic education amongst the youth.
So much.
Sure.
So at the Lowy Institute, in our Pacific Islands program, we have a project called the AusPNG Network. It's a combination of leadership building and public diplomacy, in the sense that our focus is on improving understanding between Papua New Guinea and Australia at the community level. Our core stakeholder group are young people, so our main activity is something called the Emerging Leaders Dialogue. We have this week-long residential activity that we run every year, and follow-up activities throughout the year, where we target 10 Australian and 10 Papua New Guinean young people under 40, very broad definition of that, from a range of different sectors, from civil society, from government, from business, sports, the arts, journalism. The objective there is to build those peer-to-peer connections, recognizing that Not only is it important for young people in Australia to have a better understanding of where we're placed in the world actually, but recognizing that there's a huge youth cohort in Papua New Guinea and across the Pacific, really, that will come to shape the nature of the region. They will make political decisions, economic decisions, choices about culture. Some of the themes that really resonated with me, young people, particularly from the PNG side, say they feel like they're walking in two worlds. As young people, they feel connected to global narratives. They feel globally aware. They feel that they're global citizens. But there's also this deep cultural and traditional side of their identity. And sometimes it's not related to the things they're watching or reading or speaking about, their aspirations. Sometimes it's in direct conflict with that. But as individuals, they have to find a way to marry these two. So we're going to see a lot of change, a lot of social transformation throughout the Pacific as a consequence of this cohort of people coming through, being globally connected, but also physically placed in their traditional communities, their traditional lands. And so it's so important to connect these people with other young people, to build those networks as early as possible so that by the time they are 40 or 50, they have these trusted relationships across borders, and they can discuss issues that affect the region. Connecting young people, and not just through formal parliamentary or democratic institutions, but thinking more broadly of young people as individual change makers. The other resonating theme is just how isolating it can be to be a young person seeking to affect a change in whatever sector, whether it's through film or music or changing social norms within your village or your community. Whatever it is, that change-making journey can be incredibly isolating. So just the simple act of connecting with other people who are trying to affect change, even in another sector, we found is really empowering for those individuals. So I say, more support for civil society that seeks to connect young people in a physical and sustained way, and more support for formal institutions accommodating the interest and cultivating the interest of young people in formal parliamentary processes.
Thank you both. So we are out of time for questions. Thank you everyone who did give us a question, and thank you very much to Mihai Sora and Lord Fakafanua. Thank you.
Thank you again to our speakers, and please join me in thanking Noreen Chowdhury as well. That takes us through to lunch. Now we have a fantastic session planned for you for this afternoon. So lunch is now served from 1:45, and then if you can reconvene for 1:50, and we'll kick off again at 1:55. It sounds very precise, but we want to make sure we have time for this afternoon. We've got some great things planned. So we'll see you again for 1:55. Thank you.